Sarah Martinez had learned long ago to keep her head down and blend into the background. At 28 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more than most people twice her age, but she never let it show. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same casual civilian clothes as everyone else in the contractor mess hall at the remote military base in Afghanistan. The base buzzed with activity as hundreds of contractors, military personnel, and support staff moved through their daily routines. Sarah worked as a communications specialist, according to her official paperwork, though the reality of her job was far more complex. She had been deployed here for 3 months, maintaining her cover while conducting classified operations that would remain buried in government files for decades to come. The mess hall during lunch hour was a melting pot of personalities and egos. Construction workers, IT specialists, logistics coordinators, and security contractors all gathered to grab their meals and decompress from the harsh realities of working in a war zone. Sarah preferred to eat alone, usually finding a corner table where she could observe her surroundings while staying invisible to the various cliques that had formed among the civilian workforce. On this particular Tuesday, the temperature outside had reached 115 degrees, and the air conditioning in the mess hall provided a welcome relief. Sarah had just collected her lunch tray when she noticed the tension in the room had shifted. A group of 6 contractors, all men in their 30s and 40s, had been drinking beer despite the early hour. Their voices had grown louder over the past 20 minutes, and their conversation had taken on an increasingly aggressive tone. These men worked for different security companies, but had bonded over their shared belief that they were the toughest people on the base. Most of them were former military, though their service had been brief and unremarkable. They spent their evenings bragging about hypothetical fights they would win and criticizing everyone around them who they perceived as weak or undeserving of respect. Sarah recognized the type immediately. She had encountered similar groups throughout her career, men who used intimidation and aggression to mask their own insecurities. They were particularly hostile toward women whom they viewed as inferior and out of place in what they considered their domain. Sarah had hoped to finish her meal and leave before attracting their attention, but fate had other plans. As she walked toward an empty table in the corner, her path took her past their group. One of them, a thick-set man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos covering his arms, deliberately stuck out his foot. Sarah saw it coming and easily stepped around it, but the action had served its purpose. She was now on their radar. "Hey there, sweetheart," the man called out, causing his friends to snicker. "You new around here? I don't think I've seen you before." Sarah continued walking without acknowledging him, which only seemed to fuel his determination to get a reaction. The group's attention was now fully focused on her, and she could feel the energy in the room beginning to shift. Other people in the mess hall had started to notice the brewing confrontation, but most looked away, unwilling to get involved in what appeared to be developing into an unpleasant situation. "I'm talking to you," the man said, raising his voice. "It's rude to ignore people who are being friendly." Sarah reached her table and set down her tray, still maintaining her calm demeanor. She had dealt with countless similar situations throughout her career, and she knew that engaging with them would only escalate the conflict. Her training had taught her to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately, but her cover required her to play the role of a civilian contractor who would likely be intimidated by such behavior. The leader of the group, apparently unsatisfied with her lack of response, stood up from his table. He was joined by 2 of his companions, and they began walking toward her. Sarah continued eating her sandwich, though every sense was now heightened and ready for action. She mentally cataloged the positions of everyone in the room, identified potential weapons and escape routes, and calculated the most efficient way to neutralize multiple attackers if the situation deteriorated. "We're just trying to be friendly here," the man said as he approached her table. "The least you could do is say hello." Sarah finally looked up at him with the expression of someone who was annoyed but trying to avoid trouble. "I'm just trying to eat my lunch in peace," she said quietly. "I'm not bothering anyone." This response seemed to trigger something in the man, as if her calm tone was somehow disrespectful to his authority. "You think you're too good to talk to us?" he asked, his voice growing more aggressive. "Let me tell you something, lady. This isn't some corporate office back in the States. This is a dangerous place, and people like you need people like us to keep you safe." The other contractors had now joined their leader, forming a loose semicircle around Sarah's table. Their body language was clearly intended to be intimidating, and several other people in the mess hall had stopped eating to watch what was happening. Sarah noticed that none of the base security personnel were present, which was both fortunate and concerning. Fortunate because she wouldn't have to maintain her cover in front of people who might later ask questions, but concerning because it meant no one was going to intervene if things got out of hand. "I appreciate that everyone here has an important job to do," Sarah replied, still maintaining her calm tone. "I'm just asking to be left alone to finish my meal." The leader laughed, but it was a harsh sound without any genuine humor. "You hear that, boys? She wants to be left alone. Maybe we should tell her about how dangerous it is for a woman to be alone out here. Maybe she needs someone to explain how things work." Sarah could see where this was heading, and she began making subtle adjustments to her posture and positioning. To anyone watching, she appeared to be simply shifting in her chair. But she was actually preparing for the possibility that she might need to defend herself. Her right hand moved slightly closer to her water glass, which could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. Her left foot shifted to give her better leverage if she needed to stand quickly. "Look," she said, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to do my job like everyone else." "Your job?" the man scoffed. "What job is that exactly? Sitting at a computer all day, filing paperwork? Let me tell you about real work, sweetheart. Real work is what we do. Real work is putting our lives on the line every day to protect people like you who couldn't survive 5 minutes without us." The verbal abuse continued for several more minutes, with the men taking turns making increasingly crude and threatening comments. They seemed to be feeding off each other's energy, and Sarah could sense that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where they might escalate from verbal intimidation to physical confrontation. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just a communications specialist. For the past 8 years, she had been a member of one of the most elite military units in the world. She was a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women who had successfully completed the grueling training program and been accepted into the Special Operations community. Her current assignment was classified at the highest levels, and her cover identity had been carefully constructed to hide her true capabilities. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. These men, who were boasting about their importance and toughness, had no idea that the person they were trying to intimidate had more combat experience than all of them combined. Sarah had conducted operations in some of the most dangerous locations on Earth, had been in firefights that these contractors couldn't even imagine, and had earned the respect of some of the most elite warriors in the American military. But maintaining her cover was paramount to the success of her mission, and revealing her true identity wasn't an option unless absolutely necessary. She continued to play the role of a civilian contractor who was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the attention she was receiving. "Please just leave me alone," she said, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice as if she was becoming frightened. "I haven't done anything to you." This apparent sign of fear only encouraged the men further. The leader leaned down and placed both hands on her table, bringing his face closer to hers in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. "Here's what's going to happen," he said in a low voice that was intended to sound menacing. "You're going to come have a drink with us and show us a little respect. And if you're nice to us, maybe we'll make sure you stay safe while you're here." Sarah looked around the mess hall and noticed that most of the other people had either left or were studiously avoiding looking in her direction. No one was going to come to her aid, which meant she was going to have to handle this situation herself. She took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Sarah slowly stood up from her chair, and for a moment, the contractors seemed pleased that their intimidation tactics were working. They expected her to meekly follow them to their table, where they would continue their harassment while feeling superior about their ability to dominate someone they perceived as weaker. What happened next caught them completely off guard. Instead of moving toward their table, Sarah stepped back slightly and assumed a relaxed but balanced stance. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but to anyone trained in combat, the change would have been immediately recognizable. She was no longer playing the role of an intimidated civilian. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away," she said, her voice no longer carrying any trace of fear or uncertainty. "Go back to your table, finish your drinks, and pretend this never happened." The leader of the group blinked in confusion. This wasn't the response he had expected from someone who had seemed so frightened just moments before. The transformation in her demeanor was so complete that it took him a few seconds to process what was happening. "Excuse me?" he said, trying to regain his sense of control over the situation. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to, lady." "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied calmly. "You're 6 men who think you can intimidate one woman because you assume she can't defend herself. What you don't understand is that you're making a serious mistake." The other contractors exchanged glances. Unsure of how to interpret this sudden change, they had been expecting tears, pleading, or submission. Instead, they were facing someone who seemed completely unafraid of them, despite being outnumbered 6-1. "Are you threatening us?" one of them asked incredulously. "Do you have any idea how stupid that is?" Sarah didn't respond to the question directly. Instead, she continued to assess the tactical situation. The mess hall had mostly cleared out, which was both good and bad. Good because there were fewer civilians who might get hurt if things escalated, but bad because there were also fewer witnesses to what was about to happen. The leader, apparently deciding that he needed to reassert his dominance, reached out to grab Sarah's arm. "I think you need to learn some manners," he said. What happened in the next few seconds would be discussed in hushed tones around the base for months to come, though most people would never learn the full truth about what they had witnessed. Sarah's response was so fast and precise that most observers couldn't follow the sequence of movements. As the man's hand approached her arm, she stepped slightly to the side while simultaneously grabbing his wrist with both hands. Using his forward momentum against him, she executed a perfect arm drag that sent him stumbling past her. Before he could recover his balance, Sarah had moved behind him and applied a textbook rear-naked choke. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, and suddenly the man who had been trying to intimidate her was unconscious on the floor. The remaining 5 contractors stood frozen in shock. None of them had seen anything like what had just happened. The speed and precision of Sarah's movements were unlike anything they had encountered in their limited military experience or their work as security contractors. "What the hell?" one of them shouted, finally breaking out of his paralysis. "What did you do to him?" "He's fine," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "He'll wake up in about 30 seconds with a headache and a damaged ego. The question is whether the rest of you are smart enough to learn from his mistake." The unconscious contractor began to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. His friends helped him sit up, and he looked around in confusion, clearly trying to piece together what had happened to him. "You're some kind of fighter," another contractor said, stating the obvious. "Who trained you?" Sarah didn't answer the question. Instead, she maintained her ready stance while keeping her attention focused on all of them simultaneously. Her years of training had taught her never to focus on just one potential threat when facing multiple opponents. The contractor who had been choked was now fully conscious and getting to his feet with help from his friends. His face was red with embarrassment, as much as from the lack of oxygen he had experienced. Being subdued so easily by someone he had been trying to intimidate was a humiliation that his ego couldn't easily process. "You got lucky," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "That won't happen again." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "It won't happen again because you're going to walk away right now and leave me alone." But the man's pride had been wounded, and walking away would mean admitting defeat in front of his friends and anyone else who might have witnessed his humiliation. Instead of being smart enough to cut his losses, he decided to escalate the situation. "Get her," he said to his companions. "All of us at once. She can't fight all of us." This was exactly the kind of decision that Sarah had been hoping to avoid. Taking down one person could potentially be explained away or covered up, but what was about to happen would be much more difficult to keep quiet. However, she no longer had a choice in the matter. The 5 conscious contractors spread out slightly and began to close in on her from different angles. They weren't trained fighters, but they weren't complete amateurs either, and they had the advantage of numbers. Against a normal person, their strategy would likely have been successful. Sarah wasn't a normal person. As the first man reached for her, Sarah ducked under his arm and delivered an elbow strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for breath. Without pausing, she spun and caught the second attacker with a leg sweep that sent him crashing into a nearby table. The third contractor managed to grab her from behind, but Sarah drove her elbow back into his ribs while simultaneously stomping on his instep. His grip loosened immediately, and she was able to break free and turn to face the remaining 2 attackers. By this point, the few remaining people in the mess hall had realized that this was no ordinary fight. The woman they had assumed was just another civilian contractor was moving with the fluid precision of someone with extensive martial arts and combat training. Every strike she delivered was perfectly placed for maximum effectiveness, and she seemed to be barely exerting herself despite facing multiple opponents. The 4th contractor tried to tackle her around the waist, but Sarah sidestepped and used his momentum to throw him over her hip in a judo throw that sent him sliding across the floor. The 5th man hesitated, suddenly realizing that he was the only one left standing and that his 4 friends were all either unconscious or writhing in pain on the ground. "Your turn," Sarah said calmly, not even breathing hard despite the intense physical confrontation she had just won. The remaining contractor looked around at his fallen companions and then back at Sarah, who was standing ready for him to make his move. The smart thing to do would have been to surrender, but intelligence had never been his strong suit. He charged forward with a wild haymaker punch that Sarah easily avoided. She grabbed his extended arm, pivoted, and threw him using an over-the-shoulder technique that sent him crashing into a row of empty chairs. The fight was over. 6 men who had thought they could intimidate and possibly assault a lone woman were now lying groaning on the floor of the mess hall, thoroughly defeated by someone who had barely worked up a sweat in the process. Sarah looked around to make sure there were no additional threats, then calmly walked back to her table and sat down to finish her lunch. Her sandwich had gotten cold, but she ate it anyway while keeping one eye on the defeated contractors, who were slowly helping each other to their feet. "This didn't happen," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the mess hall. "You fell down some stairs, all of you, at the same time. That's the story you're going to tell anyone who asks about your injuries." The contractors exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. They had just been thoroughly humiliated by someone they had assumed was helpless, and now she was dictating the terms of their silence. "And if I hear that you've been bothering any other women on this base," Sarah continued, "we'll have another conversation. Except next time, I won't be so gentle." The threat hung in the air like smoke. The men who had been so confident and aggressive just minutes earlier now looked like chastened children who had been caught misbehaving. They gathered their dignity as best they could and limped out of the mess hall without another word. Sarah finished her lunch in peace, though she was very aware that word of what had happened would spread quickly through the base's rumor network. She would need to be prepared for the questions that would inevitably come, and she would need to craft a story that protected her cover while explaining her obviously advanced fighting skills. Within hours of the incident in the mess hall, word had spread throughout the entire base about the mysterious woman who had single-handedly defeated 6 security contractors. The story grew and changed with each telling, but the basic facts remained consistent. A quiet civilian contractor had displayed fighting skills that far exceeded anything a normal person should possess. Sarah had anticipated this development and had already begun preparing her cover story. When the inevitable questions came, she would claim to have extensive martial arts training that she had pursued as a hobby before her deployment. It wasn't entirely false, since she had indeed studied various fighting disciplines, though she would omit the part about learning them as part of her Navy SEAL training. The first person to approach her about the incident was her supposed supervisor, a man named David Chen who worked for the same contracting company that provided her cover identity. Chen was actually a CIA operative who served as her handler, and he was understandably concerned about the attention she had attracted. "We need to talk," Chen said quietly as he approached her workstation in the communications center. "Conference room 3, 5 minutes." Sarah nodded and finished the report she was typing before making her way to the small conference room where Chen was waiting. He had already swept the room for listening devices, a routine precaution given the sensitive nature of their real work on the base. "6 guys, Sarah?" Chen said as soon as the door closed. "Really?" "They didn't give me much choice," Sarah replied. "I tried to de-escalate the situation, but they were determined to push it to a physical confrontation." Chen rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated by the complications this would create for their mission. "Do you have any idea how many questions this is going to raise? People are already asking who you really are and where you learned to fight like that." "I can handle the questions," Sarah said confidently. "I've got a background story that will satisfy most people's curiosity without revealing anything important." "And what about the contractors you beat up? Do you think they're just going to forget about this and move on with their lives?" Sarah had been thinking about this very question since the incident occurred. The men she had defeated were exactly the type who would have difficulty accepting that they had been bested by a woman, and their wounded pride might drive them to seek revenge or at least try to discover her real identity. "I made it clear that they should keep quiet about what happened," she said. "But you're right to be concerned. We'll need to keep an eye on them." Over the next few days, Sarah's prediction proved accurate. The defeated contractors had indeed told people that they had been injured in a fall, but their explanation was met with skepticism by anyone who saw their various bruises and injuries. Meanwhile, stories about the mysterious woman fighter continued to circulate throughout the base. Sarah found herself being watched wherever she went, with people trying to catch glimpses of the person who had become something of a legend overnight. She maintained her cover by acting embarrassed about the attention and deflecting questions with modest claims about having taken some self-defense classes back home. The real test came when Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's senior non-commissioned officer, requested a meeting with her. Rodriguez was a 20-year Army veteran who had served multiple combat deployments, and Sarah knew that he would be much harder to fool than the average person. "Ms. Martinez," Rodriguez said as she entered his office, "I understand you had some trouble in the mess hall a few days ago." "It wasn't trouble exactly," Sarah replied carefully. "Just some men who had too much to drink and got a little too friendly. I was able to handle the situation." Rodriguez studied her face intently. His years of experience had taught him to read people, and something about Sarah's demeanor was setting off alarm bells in his mind. "The thing is," he continued, "I've seen a lot of people with martial arts training over the years. Hell, I've got some myself. But what you did to those 6 men, that wasn't just weekend karate classes. Sarah maintained her innocent expression while mentally preparing for more intensive questioning. "I've been studying martial arts since I was a kid," she said. "My father was in the military, and he wanted me to be able to protect myself." "What branch?" Rodriguez asked immediately. "Army," Sarah replied without hesitation. "He served 3 tours in Iraq before retiring as a staff sergeant." Rodriguez nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. It was a plausible explanation for her fighting skills, and the specificity of her response suggested that she wasn't making it up on the spot. "Well," he said, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay and that those idiots weren't going to give you any more trouble. If they do, you come see me immediately." Sarah thanked him and left his office, relieved that she had passed his scrutiny. However, she knew that her problems were far from over. The 6 contractors she had defeated were becoming increasingly frustrated with the attention the incident was receiving, and their wounded pride was making them desperate to restore their reputations. 3 days after her meeting with Rodriguez, Sarah noticed that she was being followed. 2 of the contractors from the mess hall incident were attempting to track her movements around the base, probably hoping to catch her alone, somewhere they could confront her without witnesses. Sarah decided to take control of the situation before it could escalate further. She deliberately led them to a remote area behind one of the storage buildings, where she turned and waited for them to catch up. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" she asked as they approached. The 2 men looked surprised to discover that she had been aware of their surveillance. They had thought they were being stealthy, but Sarah's training had made her hyper-aware of anyone following her. "We want to know who you really are," one of them said. "Nobody fights like that without serious training, and we want to know what you're hiding." Sarah sighed inwardly. She had hoped that the men would eventually lose interest and move on, but their persistence was forcing her to consider more permanent solutions to the problem. "I'm exactly who I appear to be," she said. "A communication specialist with some martial arts training. Nothing more, nothing less." "That's garbage and you know it," the second man said aggressively. "We've been asking around, and nobody knows anything about your background before you showed up here. Your whole identity is fake." This was a more serious problem than Sarah had anticipated. If these men continued their investigation, they might eventually uncover information that could compromise not just her cover, but her entire mission. "You're paranoid," she said dismissively. "Just because you got beaten up doesn't mean there's some grand conspiracy. Sometimes people just aren't who you expect them to be." But even as she spoke, Sarah was making calculations about how to handle the situation if these men proved to be a continuing threat to her cover. She had options available to her, but all of them would create new complications that she preferred to avoid. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had apparently been looking for the 2 contractors. "Johnson, Stevens," he called out as he rounded the corner. "There you are. I need to talk to both of you about your incident reports from last week." The 2 men exchanged nervous glances. They had submitted false reports about their injuries, claiming they had fallen downstairs, and they were probably worried that Rodriguez had discovered their deception. "We'll finish this conversation later," Johnson muttered to Sarah before following Rodriguez back toward the main part of the base. Sarah watched them go, realizing that her situation was becoming more complex by the day. The attention from the mess hall incident was attracting exactly the kind of scrutiny that could endanger her mission, and she was running out of options for deflecting it. That evening, Sarah met with Chen again to discuss the deteriorating situation. They both agreed that her cover was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and they began developing contingency plans for extracting her from the base if necessary. "The mission is too important to risk," Chen said. "If we have to pull you out and bring in someone else, we'll do it." "Give me a few more days," Sarah requested. "I think I can still salvage this situation without compromising the operation." Chen was skeptical, but he agreed to give her more time. However, he also began making preparations for an emergency extraction, just in case Sarah's confidence proved to be misplaced. The next morning, Sarah was surprised to receive a visit from Colonel Harrison, the base commander. Harrison was a career officer who rarely interacted directly with civilian contractors, and his presence in her work area immediately attracted attention from everyone nearby. "Ms. Martinez," Harrison said formally, "I wonder if I could have a word with you in private." Sarah followed the colonel to his office, wondering what new complications were about to emerge. Harrison's expression was unreadable, but she could sense that this conversation was going to be significant. "Close the door," Harrison said once they were inside his office. Sarah complied and took the seat he indicated, while Harrison settled behind his desk and studied her face intently. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you," he began. "Stories about a civilian contractor with some rather impressive fighting skills." "People tend to exaggerate, sir," Sarah replied carefully. Harrison smiled slightly. "In my experience, the most dangerous people are often those who try hardest to appear harmless. Tell me, Ms. Martinez, what do you think of the security situation here on the base?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and Sarah wasn't sure how to respond without revealing more than she should. "I think the military does an excellent job of maintaining security," she said diplomatically. "What about the contractors?" Harrison pressed. "Do you think they're all as professional as they should be?" Sarah realized that this conversation was heading in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Harrison seemed to be fishing for information, but she couldn't determine what he was really after. "Most people here are just trying to do their jobs," she said. "But there are always a few who cause problems." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "The reason I ask is that I've been looking into the backgrounds of some of our security contractors, and I've discovered some interesting discrepancies in their employment records. It seems that several of them have been less than honest about their qualifications and experience." This was news to Sarah, and she wondered where Harrison was going with this revelation. "I don't know anything about that, sir," she said honestly. "Of course not," Harrison agreed. "But I do know that someone with genuine training was able to defend herself when these unqualified contractors stepped out of line. Someone who demonstrated the kind of skills that can only be acquired through extensive professional instruction." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Harrison was clearly more perceptive than she had given him credit for, and his careful choice of words suggested that he suspected more about her true identity than was comfortable. "I'm not sure what you're implying, sir," she said. Harrison leaned back in his chair and regarded her with an expression that seemed almost amused. "I'm not implying anything, Ms. Martinez. I'm simply acknowledging that sometimes the people who appear to be ordinary civilians are actually the most extraordinary individuals on the base. And sometimes the best way to maintain security is to make sure those individuals can continue their important work without unnecessary interference." The meaning behind his words was clear, even though he had been careful not to state it directly. Somehow, Colonel Harrison had figured out that Sarah wasn't who she appeared to be, and he was offering her his protection rather than exposing her. "I appreciate your confidence in the base's security measures, sir," Sarah said, matching his careful tone. "Excellent," Harrison said, standing to indicate that the meeting was over. "I'm glad we understand each other. And Ms. Martinez, if you have any further problems with unqualified contractors, please don't hesitate to bring them to my attention." Sarah left Harrison's office with a sense of relief that she hadn't felt in days. Having the base commander's tacit protection would make her job much easier, and it would also serve as a powerful deterrent to anyone who might be tempted to continue investigating her background. True to Harrison's implicit promise, the harassment from the defeated contractors stopped immediately. Word somehow reached them that their continued interest in Sarah's identity would not be tolerated, and they suddenly found themselves with more pressing concerns to occupy their time. Sarah was able to return her focus to her real mission, conducting the classified operations that had brought her to the base in the first place. The incident in the mess hall became just another story that people told about the strange and unpredictable nature of life in a war zone. Years later, after Sarah had completed her deployment and moved on to other assignments, she would sometimes think about that day when she had been forced to reveal just a glimpse of her true capabilities. It had been a reminder that even the most carefully constructed cover could be compromised by unexpected circumstances, and that the line between protecting a mission and protecting oneself was sometimes impossibly thin. The contractors who had tried to intimidate her never learned her real identity, but they carried the memory of their defeat for the rest of their lives. It served as a humbling reminder that in a world full of dangerous people, the most dangerous ones often looked exactly like everyone else.